I don't know where this interview with longevity scientist Matt Kaeberlein is going to go today because, well, we have something of a history, even though we have never actually spoken before. Because in a reaction video on my report called David Sinclair's Longevity Lie, Kaeberlein called my work emotionally driven conspiracy theory stuff, and that my goal was not to be credible, but instead to optimize views.
I'm sure you can find things to criticize David Sinclair and Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia about, but this idea that they're all part of this old boys network that's contaminating the scientific literature is just not true.
I want to give a little bit of compliment sandwich too, because I do subscribe to Scott, and he has sort of opened my eyes to some other things. So I think there's a need for people like him, but it's just sort of filtering out.
Yeah, I guess, I agree. I guess the question would be, the things he's opened your eyes to, are they real or not? Like, how do you know?
Yes.
Right? Because if you don't have my background, you might not know what I just said.
Right? Very true.
Kaeberlein has had an impressive career as a biogerontologist and is quite well known for his research about the underlying mechanisms of aging that have been preserved across the bushy shrub of life. He has won lots of awards and got his PhD from MIT. His best-known work examines the cellular mechanisms that extended life of yeast cells, and he's been cited more than 4,000 times. He runs a company called Optispan and a related YouTube channel, which you can access at the link down below. According to his website, its core focus lies in promoting longevity and health span optimization through proactive health measures rather than in waiting for chronic conditions to manifest. I don't think Kaeberlein and I see eye to eye on everything, but we do share a common interest in upholding the integrity of the scientific process and a desire to see less suffering in the world overall. We're also keen on calling out scientific fraud when it shows up. Today, we're going to have a discussion about the entire field of longevity medicine, which I believe is full of charlatans and misleading health claims. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Matt.
Sure. My pleasure, Scott. Looking forward to it.
You were the co-director of the Dog Aging Project, which aims to extend dog life and health spans. You also famously came out very publicly against David Sinclair when he claimed to have astounding results in that same area. What did Sinclair claim, and why did it provoke you to break ties?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on. I think that having sort of honest dialogue, straightforward, is the way to go. So I think we both agree with that. I started the Dog Aging Project along with Daniel Promislo and Kate Creevy about 10 years ago now, 2013, 2014, really with the goal of understanding the biology of aging in companion dogs. So we're talking only about dogs living in the human environment with their owners, not dogs in the research world. So understanding the biology of aging, and then hopefully being able to apply some of what we had learned or have learned, continue to learn in the laboratory to improve health span and lifespan in people's pets. And this is an area that I've been studying since I was a graduate student, as you alluded to. And I feel very passionately about the idea that our ultimate goal is really to increase the healthy years of life, both for people and for our companion animals. I'm a dog person. I've always had dogs. I totally understand the perspective that our companion animals are part of our families. And so this mission of the Dog Aging Project is something that is really important to me and I really believe in. And so, I don't think that David's company, where they have marketed a supplement to potentially have a positive impact on health in companion animals, is unique. There are lots of supplements in the companion animal space. I think what bothered me about the way that product was rolled out was the press release that claimed that this was the first product clinically proven to reverse aging in pets. There are several aspects of that are just simply not true, and it really, I think, was kind of the last straw for me in this pattern of behavior that I had seen from David of what I would consider dishonest or misleading presentation of his research. And in particular, I think the fact that this is a tenured Harvard professor using the Harvard brand to market a product and make false claims about that product, particularly in the companion animal space, to me personally was just to the point where I had had enough. I felt like it was important that somebody in the field stood up and said something. And I saw an opportunity to potentially raise awareness by resigning my position in the organization that David and I were both members of, and that David was the president of at the time. And so that's what I did. So I put out a public statement after informing the board of the organization that I was going to resign my position. I put out a public statement on Twitter that basically just explained what I just said here in much shorter format, as you have to do on Twitter or X.
Yeah, and you sort of set fire to the longevity space when you did that. These
honestly,
were shots fired.
That was not my intention. Honestly, my intention was not to create a big firestorm. It was simply to raise awareness. I think, and it sort of surprised me in a sense that it did, because everybody in the field already knew this was happening, right? It should not have surprised anyone that that this was dishonest behavior. Everyone, at least among the scientific community, who read that press release knew that it was a lie. So I was a little surprised, actually, that people acted so shocked.
For the people who, maybe are not totally up on your tweets, what were these false claims? Was it that this was the first clinical supplement proven to make dogs live longer, or was it that there are no supplements that make dogs live longer, or was it something else?
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's the same lie, right? The idea that any supplement has been proven to increase lifespan. And actually, what the first version of the press release said was the first supplement clinically proven to reverse aging. So it's not even clear that this supplement or any supplement has a positive impact on the aging process in dogs or people. And it certainly is not the case that there's any evidence, let alone clinical proof, for reversing biological aging. So that just is, on the surface, obviously not true. And so, it doesn't make sense to me that some people would be surprised that I would call that out. I think that it is our obligation, if we're, honest scientists and have some standing in the field, to call out dishonest behavior in the field.
So the entire field of longevity medicine has always sat with me as problematic, especially from its very first, the very first pitch of humanity ever in written form we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is, essentially Gilgamesh goes out to save his best friend, I think it was Enkidu was his name, by bringing him back to life and sort of finding the solution to immortality. And this is where I cite in a lot of my work the immortality grift, because since then, which is again the first writing, so I bet orally we were saying the same thing before then, we have constantly been selling this idea that through alchemy or magic or now science, that we can reverse aging, we can find eternal youth, we can build pyramids and live eternally in the sky. We have all sorts of iterations of this, and some are just maybe you'll live longer. I am constantly worried about this field as promoting that same story that has existed for millennia, with scientific frosting on top of it. What can you say to that initially? I'm going to follow this up with several statements asking this question from different angles.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is when you have to differentiate between the science of aging and sort of the marketing of longevity. And I think, unfortunately, over the past 5 to 10 years, these things have become blended in ways that are not completely healthy. I think there are some good aspects of that blending or sort of expansion of the community, but I think there are a lot of challenging aspects that go along with it. I think one thing I would mention explicitly is the talk about immortality is a tiny fraction of what I would consider legitimate science in the field, right? So I think pointing to that as, what the community is about is misleading. It is not the case that most members of the community are believers that we are going to accomplish immortality, are trying to sell immortality. There's a small fraction of what I would consider fringe elements that maybe get a lot more attention. And I would actually put this back on the media, of which you are historically at least a member of, for amplifying that message. That
I'm
is
still
not
a member of the media. We're both on social media. You and I, we
okay.
both have YouTube
Okay,
channels.
I don't have any credentials in media. I will put it that way. Regardless, that's what gets clicks. That's what people talk about. That's a tiny fraction of what's actually happening. So I don't think it's intellectually honest to point to that. I think there's lots of things you can point to. I don't think it's intellectually honest to point to that and criticize the entire community based on that sort of fringe element. So
Well,
I would
even if we take immortality off the table, which is of course not really what I was ever talking about, but we are talking about extending lifespans with pills that promote seemingly almost magical results. I
I
mean,
don't think they're magical. I think you're using words that don't actually make sense in this context. And trying to increase lifespan, whether it's by waiting until people are sick and trying to cure their disease, or trying to modify the biological processes that are the greatest risk factor for all of those diseases, conceptually, I think is exactly the same. Our goal is to give people more quality years of life, as many quality of years of life as we possibly can. So I think, again, let's take a step back and let's look at the underlying biology, and then let's see whether you and I disagree on that. And if we don't, then we can talk about some of the individuals or some of the specific marketing tactics that are being used. But from the scientific perspective, if you look at the leading causes of death and disability in every nation in the world, they all have at their root a single greatest risk factor, with the exception of one. If we just take the 10 leading causes of death in the United States, 9 of those 10 have biological aging as their single greatest risk factor. That is a fact. That is a fact. You can't argue with it. I mean, you can argue with it, you'll just be wrong, but that is a fact. The one that doesn't is accidents. And if we put under accidents, illegal drug use, okay, overdoses. The other 9 all have age as their greatest risk factor. So now the question becomes, and this I think we can have a discussion about, is it more effective? Are we more likely to be successful if we try to modify those diseases by waiting until people have them and treating their symptoms or curing the disease? Or would it be more effective to target the biology that underlies all of those diseases, biological aging, slow that process to prevent the onset and progression of all of the diseases?
Can I ask a really basic question? What is aging?
So again, I'm talking about biological aging. It is the biological process that is a continuation of developmental processes. We understand a lot of the proteins, metabolites in that network. It is the biological process that leads to dysfunction within cells and tissues, loss of homeostasis over time. And it is a continuation of developmental processes. And there's actually a pretty solid evolutionary explanation for why these same developmental processes would drive biological aging. And again, we can get into that if you'd like to. It's probably beyond the scope. I think it's important to understand, though, there's a lot of research that has gone into this topic that we do understand at a fairly detailed level. Now, do we understand all of biological aging? No, of course not. I would never argue that. Are we close to solving biological aging? I don't personally think so. Do we understand enough that we can actually target specific components of that network, slow the aging process by 20, 30, 40, 50% in every animal where this has ever been tested in a laboratory? Yes, we do. Have we proven we can do the same thing in humans yet? No, we haven't. But I think anybody who understands evolutionary biology recognizes it is almost a certainty that many of these same mechanisms that regulate biological aging in laboratory animals will regulate biological aging in people. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. And I guess what caused me to react as negatively as I did to some of what was in your original video was the idea that we should throw out the entire field and all of the really good science that's happening here because of the actions of a few bad actors in the space.
Yeah, and I think that you were very right to point out or earlier that there's the question between the science and the marketing, right?
Yeah,
And we have the science when we're talking about underlying biological mechanisms, reducing metabolism. You are going to be I can't even really have an intellectual discussion with you about this because I am not somebody who's done clinical research or
sure.
nor an expert on the field. What I will say, however, is that humans age. Like everything ages, and to create a category that aging is a disease,
Yeah.
that aging is like you said that out of the top 10 categories of things that go wrong with humans and cause death.
Leading causes of
A-
death and disability, at least, yes.
sure, and aging, to say that aging causes that is for me a little bit problematic, because the question of what is aging, when I think of aging, I don't necessarily think metabolic dysfunction as time goes by. I think about, I was born, at the end of my life I will die, and over the course of that time period, we go
Yeah.
through a natural process. And
Yeah.
one more moment thing here, you also said that that some of these things, such as heart disease, such as like high blood pressure, I don't really know what these top 10 causes you are, but I think we can probably look up a list and agree that they are there. Um, that medicine itself, the practice of medicine, which has gone on since Hippocrates at least, has been to extend human life and reduce human suffering, and it has always been to take practical approaches to alleviating the symptoms of things that lead up to death. So when we make a separate category of longevity medicine instead of just medicine,
Yeah.
practical normal medical advice, it seems to me that you're talking about something else. It seems to me that you're talking about targeting something which is not what doctors have been doing all along, but actually something different.
Yeah. So I think that's a fair point. I would say so. I think you've also put three or four different things in there that are each worth commenting on and
Sure.
important. So
Mm-hmm.
let's save the longevity medicine piece for a minute. I'll just say I
This is
think
going to be a 3-hour conversation, guys,
it's
just so
more
you
about
know.
the fundamental approach to health and what we call it. I think we can agree or disagree on.
Mm-hmm.
The biology of aging, though, again, I totally get what you're saying, and I think this is in part on members of the field for not doing a good enough job communicating what we mean by the biology of aging. It's hard. It's really hard to communicate the complexity of this biology in a way that people who aren't trained biologists are going to get. But here's one way that maybe it will help you understand what I'm thinking of conceptually when I think of the biology of aging. So if we go back to dogs, right? You've heard the idea that 1 human year is 7 dog years, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
I have no idea.
Well, no, what does that mean to you? When we say 1 human year is 7 dog years?
Mm-hmm. Well, dogs have shorter lifespans, and I guess if
It's not
the
just
average
about
human,
lifespans, though, is it?
I
Functionally?
mean, that statement, a dog year is 7 years. I didn't think it was scientific, but if you're saying it's scientific, then I'm super
Come on,
interested.
whether it's
But
7 years or 10 years or it's nonlinear, it doesn't matter. Don't avoid the question.
no, I'm not.
What does that
Not
mean to
trying
you?
to. I'm not
It
trying to.
means,
I'm trying to answer your question.
okay,
So,
what does it
what
mean?
a dog year is seven is? Say the question again.
1 human year is 7 dog years. You look at a dog, they get
They
all
age
of the same
faster.
diseases of aging that we do. It
Okay.
happens faster. They get
Mm-hmm.
all of the same functional declines that we do. It happens faster. Do you
Mm-hmm.
accept the premise, at least, that dogs age biologically faster than people do? Or at least that the process looks very similar and it's happening at an accelerated rate?
Yeah, I would think so. I don't necessarily see a problem with what you're saying.
Okay. So if you accept that dogs age biologically faster at accelerated rate compared to people, and other animals are also aging more quickly than humans, some are aging more slowly than humans. It's not just lifespan, it's the entire functional decline, that entire process.
Mm-hmm.
If we can understand that biology, that's just genes and environment. That's the only difference between a dog and a human. Their DNA and their environmental factors. That's biology. If we can understand that biology, we should be able to study that. It's no different than
Sure.
any other biological process we study in the laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
If we can understand that biology sufficiently, we should be able to modulate it, modify it in a way that will slow the onset and progression of all of the functional declines and diseases of aging. And hopefully you accept that premise. But if you don't, we have lots and lots of proof that we can do this in laboratory animals, including mice and rats, which are pretty complicated animals. They're not so far away from dogs. They're not so far away from humans. So at least up to the level of complicated mammals, we can do this experimentally, and we know enough about that biological process to know which genes to target in some cases to do that. We can make rational, specific changes to the genome, or we can develop drugs that target those genes, those proteins, to have the desired outcome that we seem to slow aging. The animals don't get the same diseases, the same functional declines at the same rate. They get them slower, and they live 20%, 30%, in some cases up to 50% longer. So I think there's enough evidence already out there to say this is possible in laboratory animals to, in a targeted way, slow biological aging and delay the onset and progression of all of these functional declines and diseases. I would agree that it is still unproven that we can do this in humans, or that we can do it to the same magnitude of effect. That, I think, is a place where some of the...
Which is why your dog aging project seems very interesting, because you're trying to study dogs in an environment which is the natural environment. Well, not the natural environment, listen, the jungle, but as in the pet environment of my
the
couch.
environment we all live in today, whether it's natural or unnatural.
And I think that's, I mean, I think these are worthwhile things to ask. I think these are worthwhile questions to put out there. I am worried about the marketing aspect of this a lot.
Me too.
I'm worried about how this gets interpreted, how, I always like to say, let's see results before let's go sell a thing. And the world as it works now is we sell the thing and then we hope for results. And it is a big problem in my mind. And, so I was looking at OptiSpan's website this morning, and you said, or I don't know if you wrote the website, but the website says that, modern medicine operates on 19th century principles. And I want to know, why are the principles that underlie the paradigm of evidence-based medicine that we are existing in now, that we're using to treat people, why are we supposed to use 20th century principles? And I don't even know what these principles are, to tell you the truth. Is this like Peter Attia's Medicine 3.0? Why do we think that a different set of underlying evidentiary principles will deliver better health outcomes?
Yeah. So the way I think about this, I actually think that the paradigm of isolating diseases in silos and studying or treating those diseases in isolation is I don't know if flawed is the right approach, because it made sense 50 years ago, but it's an inefficient approach today. And unfortunately, this culture has evolved, not just in the clinical practice of medicine, but all the way back to the way research is funded at the basic biomedical perspective, to drug development and small biotechs, to big pharma development. And again, if you and I were to sit and have a much longer conversation, I think we would agree there are lots of problems in the current system as it exists today. But I think this paradigm of studying diseases in isolation has led to a situation where most of the time we wait until people are sick before we take action. We are largely a reactive healthcare system today. And we try to cure the disease, but in reality, we have been very, very poor at the population level at curing disease. At the individual level, sure, lots and lots of huge successes, which I'm not minimizing, are really, really important. If somebody I loved had cancer, I'd want that cancer cured. And we do that at the individual level. At the population level, we have been really, really bad at curing diseases. We haven't cured a single major disease at the population level, at least significant age-related disease.
We've cured lots of diseases at the population level. Vaccines.
Okay.
Almost
age-related. So again, I'm going back to the top 10 killers.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to those ones. Okay.
Yeah, the ones that kill most people, right?
Mm-hmm.
That seems important.
It seems like you're this approach, which is not only you, of course, right? This approach is fundamentally redefining what a disease is. If we look at clinical practice, well, if we look at clinical practice, right, and we look at a doctor attends to someone, they say they have symptoms, and the doctor looks for signs. This is the basic medical approach when you come to your doctor. I have a problem. you go to the doctor to solve the problem. What you're saying, I believe, is that disease is actually something more fundamental. Before a problem arises, we can detect it and treat it before anyone knows it's a disease. That leads to an epistemological problem here, is how do we know we've cured a disease if it's never manifested itself?
Well, we've prevented it. And honestly, I don't think it matters if people aren't getting the diseases that they are currently getting at the same rate. So again, I don't think it's a matter of definition. I think you can ask the question, how early can we detect signals of pathology or dysregulation, whatever you want to call it, and then act on those signals? And I would argue we can do it much earlier than we have today. But I do think the framework of disease as we are defining it today, and I'm going to use the CDC definition, that seems like a reasonable place to start.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
That framework, I think, has led to an inefficient approach to health. And again, if you look at the numbers at the population level, they back this up. There are far more people living longer with chronic disease today than there were 30 years ago, and far more than there were 50 years ago, right? That is a direct effect. And again, part of that is successes of increasing life expectancy. But part of it is the fact that people are getting chronic diseases earlier in life because of lifestyle habits. I just don't think we can argue with that. And so those two factors have led to a situation where the average American spends more than 50% of their life with at least one chronic disease as defined by the CDC. There has been an expansion of sick span in the United States and in many other developed countries as a direct result of two factors. One is the obesity epidemic, which is lifestyle related, and the other is the way that we practice medicine, our reactive approach to keeping people healthy. I think we can do better. And that's fundamentally all it comes down to. This is not saying we need to get rid of the reactive disease care system. People are still going to get sick. We still need those approaches. We still, if somebody you cared about got sick or yourself, you'd want to try to fix it. But I do think we can do better at keeping people healthy. And that's fundamentally all that this movement is about, is trying to raise.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, that all sounds great. I think what my issue is epistemologically speaking, is that how do we know we are treating a disease when we don't have evidence that we've treated a disease? Like that, this is it's a real problem. If you say, hey, I'm going to give you a pill today, and let's call it M&M. Not NMN, it's M&M. It's a chocolate pill. And if I say that if I give you an M&M, I will have cured and then we can name any condition.
Sure.
It doesn't matter what, it's cancer, erectile dysfunction, beauty standards. I don't care. We give you this pill, and then we've averted it. But how do we know that the pill worked? And I feel like this is I feel like I don't think it's wrong what you're doing at all. I think it's great that what you're doing, but I worry about this whole paradigm, which says we can treat something that we don't know exists, and we don't have population data necessarily to prove it, because we don't have sample sizes in most cases to say that we've isolated it in a reductivist way to say this M&M cured that condition.
Right. So here's what one way I would think about it is I would think about it as a continuum of evidence, and each individual can decide sort of where on that continuum you fall. So you've sort of pointed to the ridiculous end. And again, at OptiSpan, we're not selling pills, first of all. So if you're talking about us, I think I want to clarify that.
I'm talking about the functional medicine in general.
Yeah. Well, okay. Again, you're trying to put an umbrella over a pretty diverse set of medical practitioners, all the way through to the supplement industry and beyond, right? Sure. So again, I don't think that's fair. And I don't think it's actually helpful, because I do think there are people doing really good work in this space on the scientific side, on the medical side, that shouldn't necessarily be lumped in with bad actors. In my view, at least, people who are bad actors.
What is the thing that differentiates that, would you say? How do we draw that line?
Right.
Because I'm very interested in drawing this line myself, because I'm struggling with this. But how do we know that the person who says they're science-based is in fact doing that honest research where we know that they're on the right side of that thing, especially when we don't have 19th century evidence to prove an efficacy?
Well, so first of all, again, you're sort of pointing to 19th century approaches as being the gold standard. There's a lot of problems with the way that we do 19th century medicine, and clinical trials are a good example. Clinical trials get shit wrong all the time. So again, let's not pretend like that's a perfect system in terms of actual data, right? Okay, so I think to answer your question though is I don't think there is a first of all that is a really important question. It's at the crux of many of these issues. I don't think there is a clear dividing line. I think there are, as I said, it's a spectrum. There are rigorous approaches, and maybe we start with some of the preventative diagnostics we could talk about that everybody would agree with. I think, right? There's a middle area which I think you can ask questions about how valuable are some of those approaches, right? At the population level or at the individual level. Let's I don't know. Let's put whole body MRI in that bucket for now. We can
Ooh,
have
yeah, let's do that.
okay. And then there's the stuff that I would put that is outside of the gray area that falls into the snake oil realm. That's where I put not all supplements, but I think a lot of supplements fall in that realm where, or at least there's very little scientific evidence to back it up. So you ask the question, how do people know what's science-based, what's evidence-based, what isn't? And it's really hard. I feel fortunate that I have a scientific background where I can go back to the primary literature and I have enough understanding that I can usually evaluate whether the studies that are used to support claims, if there are any studies used to support claims, are well-designed studies. But the reality is that scientific data takes a while to mature to the point where the community has confidence in these results, usually decades, right? And so we are operating in a situation, and this is true in reactive disease care as well, where we're often operating on probabilities. And there's a probability that this is likely to be correct, but it's not certain. That's just not the way science works. Science is
Right, of course.
always finding new evidence, right? So again, it's not black or white. I think it's important for people to understand that. So what would I put in the pretty solid bucket? That's where we try to live at OptiSpan. We try to focus on, again, certainly if we detect underlying disease, we get care for the people who have underlying disease. We often detect that underlying disease in ways that are not detected by primary care because the biomarkers that are used in primary care are very rudimentary. It's usually a basic blood work panel, and your doctor asks you some questions, and maybe you get a colonoscopy once a year. That's kind of the level that primary care is operating at. So there are a lot of people out there walking around with undiagnosed disease that is very easy to detect with just a few more diagnostics that can
Can you give
then,
me an example of what that might be?
yeah, diabetes, fatty liver are two of the big ones.
Explain to me how that might present itself before a clinical sign
Yeah.
or a symptom that would make someone want to go
Point
for
of care
care.
ultrasound is a good example. Completely non-invasive. It's kind of like the same ultrasound you would get during pregnancy. You can actually detect fatty liver. Point of care ultrasound. 10 minutes in the office. Any primary care physician could do this. Very non-expensive. And if you get it, it's a screening tool. If you detect it, then you can go get a more standard liver scan for a diagnosis, and then you can take action to treat that condition. That happens all the time. I think DEXA body composition is another tool that can be used to screen for high levels of visceral adipose or being undermuscled on your way to frailty or low bone density on your way to osteopenia, osteoporosis, costs $50.
And what is the when we talk about natural history of disease, so the progression of disease from as it goes through its course, what can we say about the fidelity of that data? And I honestly don't know this answer.
Yeah.
When you do that ultrasound, what percentage of patients would go from an ultrasound detection to a clinical prognosis in diagnosis in say a year or whatever time span is reasonable for this to predict that?
Yeah. I don't think we have data on the percentage. I can tell you that if you detect this by point of care ultrasound, a significant fraction, is it going to be 75% or 40%, will actually go then be diagnosed with fatty liver? It's a significant fraction. I don't know that anybody has done a dedicated study of point of care ultrasound to nail those percentages down. But it's enough in my view, and again, you can disagree with me if you want to, it's enough in my view that it's worthwhile considering that it costs next to nothing.
Yeah, so I think this is like one of these sort of fundamental questions and maybe it is just a value judgment between what we're saying is I see advanced screening for disease and catching something earlier and earlier is a way to get more and more treatment to a patient, and treatments often come with downsides. With if you said that I had precancer you looked in, and I actually got diagnosed with cancer yesterday. I have a basal cell right here. So right here. So like, people can find things early, right? And you can treat it, but the treatment also comes at a cost. And if we see this with mammograms all the time. People get early detection and they get too much treatment. And this is why we reduce the rate of mammogramming people, because we don't want people to have to take, mastectomies and take these other things. So when this is why that fidelity of that data is so important. And I want to defend 19th century medicine for a second here. Is one of the things that was amazing about the 19th century medicine that we can no longer do is we actually had the natural progression of lots of diseases, right? Because we had no ethics. We would test people by letting them get a disease and watching them die, which is bad. Okay, we can agree that's bad. But you could actually know what a disease did. You actually were able to say, we smallpox, they got it here, and 14 days later, they look real bad. We don't do this anymore because that encourages human suffering. But the data was better that came out of that. And I worry that if we start using clinical markers and biomarkers instead to say that the symptom will definitely occur, I think we're creating a certainty paradigm that you just rejected earlier.
I don't see that logic. I don't follow that logic. That we're creating a certainty paradigm. I certainly recognize the concerns around overdiagnosis and particularly false positives, which I think is what you were more referring to. The idea that a pre-disease would be detected that wasn't really there, and then you would do some sort of invasive procedure to treat something that wasn't real. I also do think it is the case, particularly with cancers, and I think this is where the whole body MRI is an interesting example. And I've actually changed my opinion. I'm more favorable about whole body MRI than I was 6 months ago. But I do think that's an example where precancers are detected. Sometimes they're true false positives. Sometimes they're real, but the body clears those cancers itself through regular immune function, right? So you wouldn't need treatment. So I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree that that does happen. I think the question then becomes, of all the things we could possibly do for pre-screening, where's the real value? What really helps people? And again, I think we can have legitimate conversations, and we should, and we can even end up disagreeing. I know for me personally, if I had fatty liver or if I had diabetes undiagnosed, I would want to know. I would want to know because there are things that you can do to reduce your likelihood that those are going to progress to the point where they make you really sick or kill you. And I think that's what we've seen in our programs. I do think there is a different impact of seeing in point of care ultrasound where the client can actually see the image, the same image the doctor's seeing, and have it explained to them, seeing fatty liver in your body or seeing plaque buildup, or by continuous glucose monitoring, seeing that you have prediabetes or you maybe even have diabetes. And this is how this specific food actually impacts your response. So I think part of the reason why there has been some pushback against some of these things, like continuous glucose monitoring, a good example, is because of the way they've been rolled out to people, sometimes direct to consumer, with really no information on what it means or how to interpret it or care to go along with it. And I think that's problematic. But I think these tools can have a significant amount of value for lots of people. And I do recognize there is an individual component to this. And some people might genuinely feel, I would rather not know. And that's okay. But I think people should have the opportunity to know. And I definitely believe that we have tools that could be employed in primary care. And again, where we draw the line, we come back to this. Primary care already does pre-disease screening. They just don't do it very well. And so what I would argue is we, for a relatively low cost, can do a lot better with some of these additional approaches, a couple of which I've already mentioned here, and catch a lot of disease earlier for people. It's the same concept, though, for why we do regular blood panels. There is fundamentally no different reason here than what we already do. It's just, can we do a better job?
So now a word from our sponsors, which is you. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This sort of work is incredibly hard, whether it's my hard-hitting investigative journalism or interviews with really amazing thinkers. It means the world to me that you are watching this. And there's a couple things you can do to support my work. There's obviously the algorithm part of things where you can hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. That helps the algorithm, spread this around to people. But more importantly, I just want you to know that I have this Substack newsletter, which is where the main support for my channel actually comes from. And I would love you to get early access to my work and be part of that community so that I can keep going up against really, really powerful players with just truth on my side. So consider doing that, and consider getting my newsletter where you can see, my thoughts as we go forward. And without further ado, back to our program. Yeah, I think that we are falling at different just philosophical points, and actually there's so much philosophy that's underlying what we're saying here. I am very skeptical of too much data and the optimized self, and the idea that these data points are truly meaningful. And I do think some are, because you're right. The blood panel is a great diagnostic tool to be like, hey, let's go watch out for things. On the other hand, I also don't think we totally understand how all the factors of the blood panel truly interact with one another. And, you mentioned continuous glucose monitoring, which I think is, I've heard examples of friends of mine who say that this revolutionized their life. Like, it cured, one friend says he cured cancer with continuous glucose monitoring. And the thing that, when I don't continuously glucose monitor, right?
Sure.
But the thing that is somewhat problematic about that data point is that we have studied glucose for a very long time, with diabetics and with sticking, and they've always happened at 24 or 12-hour periods, right? These sort of like intermittent, very long durations before we test. Continuous glucose monitoring does it instantaneously, so we don't have fidelitous data to say that continuous monitoring is actually the same as those larger spans. So if I eat an orange now and see my glucose spike, why is that necessarily bad? We don't have fidelitous data saying that, but we do have a lot of anxiety when we look at our phone and see that happen. I think this leads to hypervigilance, and hypervigilance is anxiety, and it creates that and a need for more care.
Yeah. So let me, I agree with much of what you said. And I do think in some people it can be anxiety producing, just like an Oura ring can be anxiety producing in some people and actually defeat the goal of getting better sleep. So there is a personal component here that's really important. But I also would suggest that we do have something closer to continuous glucose monitoring that has been used in clinical practice for, 50 years. It's called an oral glucose tolerance test, except there, instead of doing it a fasting glucose, once every 6 months, you do 6 time points over a 2-hour period and you measure glucose. And that's how you clinically diagnose diabetes. So I would say you're right in the sense we don't have the same sort of large body of CGM data that we have for fasting glucose and the reference ranges. And so there is a need for careful interpretation of that data. And I think we can detect patterns in CGM based off of oral glucose tolerance tests that are probably, and again, I don't know this because I haven't done the study myself and I haven't seen anybody else do it, but I speculate are probably as good at diagnosing prediabetes and diabetes as the standard clinical tests, with the advantage that anybody can do it in their own home. And it's not sort of as artificial as a fasting glucose measurement. And again, anybody who's really looked at the fasting glucose data will tell you at the individual level, it's all over the place. There are some people who have dawn effect. And so right before they wake up, their glucose spikes, even if though they haven't eaten anything, they'll have a high fasting glucose measurement, yet they have perfectly good glucose homeostasis. So again, it's not like the current, standard that is used in primary care is all that great. It's just the current standard that's been used for many years because it's relatively cheap. We can do it easily. And so I wouldn't throw out the new approach just because we don't have that much data from it yet. I actually think in the long run, this will be the direction that things go. But I do recognize what you said about the fact that especially I think when marketed to people in an irresponsible way, can lead to lots of misinformation and lots of anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, honestly, we are agreeing on some major points. We're just landing on some of these a little bit differently. I would like to see more data before we start selling products. I'd like to, before we have the Oura Ring, and I wore an Oura Ring for 5 years or something like that. And one of the first customers, and I had it all the time. And I was like, I don't care. I just don't care what my sleep score was. I know if I don't feel good, I didn't sleep so good. So why am I doing this? And there's this product cycle that goes with it. And that is ultimately what my channel's mostly about. It's like, it's we have science and we can say good scientific things. And then there's a philosophical debate that scientists and patients need to sort of wrestle with. And then there are people who are like, YOLO, we're going for it. We're going to make $1 billion selling, some supplement that probably doesn't work. Something like Alpha Brain that makes you smarter based on no clinical evidence. And this is where it's so important to be able to wrestle with these ideas instead of wrestling with a sales pitch. And I think that we all need these cognitive tools to go in and say, well, what are we actually buying into? And I generally don't think the science is there yet. I think that you have a better view of the science because you are a scientist. But as an investigative journalist, I am neck deep in grifters. Everywhere I look is a grifter. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I also don't want the bathwater to be so muddied with bullshit that you can't get clean.
Hey, I'm right there with you. And I would suggest, though, that many of the grifters who now call themselves longevity were grifters before longevity became popular and have just co-opted the term. So that is one of the things that I have observed is there are a lot of people who now call themselves longevity experts who have absolutely no background in longevity.
Or a lot of them are 20 years old on Instagram and look great in bikinis.
They are selling the same supplements they were selling 5 years ago, but now it's a longevity supplement. And again, I don't have a solution to that. I'm not sure there is a solution to that. I recognize it as a problem for the field, specifically for the scientific field and the legitimate medical practitioners who want to kind of do best in class in this space. But I don't know what to do about it. And so I share your concern. It is real. I feel like I have personally a pretty good handle on, where the science tails off. It's not a start and stop, sort of tails off. And then you get into the realm of just pure snake oil. And I try to do my best to communicate that. And again, it's one person's opinion, but it's pretty informed, I think.
Here's a solution. I think that longevity, the problem is not grifters co-opting the longevity name. It's the problem is that the longevity name is one of the oldest grifts in humanity, and the longevity researchers who are legitimate should have used a different name to talk about what they were doing.
Well, we tried gerontology, we tried geroscience, we tried biology of aging. The longevity moniker was sort of, bestowed upon the field. So, and I mean, honestly, when people ask me what sort of scientist are you, I usually say geroscientist, but nobody knows what that means. So, there you go.
It's not nearly as sexy. It's not it just says old person to me when I hear that. So here's another question that I had written down beforehand, and I'm just going to read it. I think I already sort of know how you might answer it.
Okay.
Longevity researcher and proponent of rapamycin, which is a very popular, I think you're studying it in dogs right now, which is an immunosuppressant drug that has been linked to longer lifespans. So this proponent of rapamycin, Mikhail Blago, you can pronounce his name better.
Misha.
Blagasklani. Yes. Wrote extensively about this immunosuppressant drug for its anti-aging and anti-cancer effects, beginning his probably most famous article on it with this quote, "From the dawn of civilization, humanity has dreamed of immortality. So why didn't the discovery of anti-aging properties of mTOR inhibitors change the world forever?" Then he quotes the entrepreneur Seth Godin, "If you wait until you are ready, it is almost certainly too late." Okay, so that obviously links to a lot of this marketing stuff that we were just chatting about, uh, and and this was actually in the journal Aging, which I think you may have been involved with at one point.
Nope,
Um,
never have
but
been actually.
okay, so I'm wrong.
I
Um,
actually, believe
Wait
it or
one moment.
not, this is
Let me
getting
just finish the question.
okay.
Blago Sklani died of metastatic lung cancer that had traveled to his brain in 2023. David Sinclair wrote his obituary on X. Should we see this as a cautionary tale?
Maybe. I mean, I don't think we could say so. So I think there's two things to say about Misha and rapamycin and his death, right? So you could view it as, did rapamycin contribute to the cancer and cause him to die early? You could view it as, did rapamycin slow the cancer and actually give him extra time? There's no way to know. We will never know. Misha, before he died, very much believed that his use of rapamycin slowed the progression of the cancer, which he believed was pre-existing before he started using cancer. He smoked for many years. I don't know. So I don't think from N of one anecdotal stories, I'm very hesitant to draw any conclusions regarding rapamycin or any other sort of intervention that people may choose to employ. I do. I mean, again, Misha was a friend of mine, colleague. I He was certainly more optimistic about rapamycin than I was. And when you first said a proponent of rapamycin, I thought you were talking about me. And I just wanted to clarify, even though a lot of people think I am a proponent of rapamycin, I think I've always been very clear in what I believe is true about rapamycin. And I'll do it as quickly as I can, but I'd like to just say it for the record because I think it's helpful to know where I'm coming from. So rapamycin is a drug. It is an inhibitor of a protein called mTOR. And what we know from preclinical studies, when I say preclinical, I mean laboratory animals. What we know from laboratory animal studies is that in every organism where this has been studied, if you genetically turn down mTOR or pharmacologically with the drug rapamycin turn down mTOR, you increase lifespan and you appear to slow the biological aging process as measured by delayed functional declines and delayed diseases of aging. And in mice, which again are about the best we can do right now, pretty complicated mammal, you can increase lifespan up to about 25%, delay cancer, delay heart disease, delay cognitive function, delay periodontal disease, delay ovarian failure, delay a bunch of other bad stuff that happens during aging. So it seems as though rapamycin slows aging in laboratory animals. Does it work in the real world in the same way? I don't know. I think there's very good reason to believe that biology of aging is shared, that if we can appropriately regulate mTOR, we can increase lifespan and health span in companion animals and in people. Will there be side effects that offset those benefits? We don't know. So I think it's important to find out. And that's partly why we're testing rapamycin in companion dogs right now. And there are multiple clinical trials happening in humans for different age-related endpoints. Yes, I have used rapamycin myself off-label. I've talked about it. I don't recommend rapamycin off-label for anybody, but I do think for people who want to explore that with their physicians, I don't see any problem with that. It's perfectly legal, and I think there are some people who can benefit from rapamycin. So that's my position on rapamycin. But I would be very careful in either the positive sense or the negative sense to take these anecdotal stories and conclude that rapamycin has particular benefits or causes particular side effects in people. We could talk more about the preponderance of data around benefits and side effects in humans and what we know, but that's sort of my position now, and that really hasn't changed in the last 5 years.
And to answer the question, what ultimately needs to be done for any intervention, right? You need to have a large pool of humans who've taken this so that you know what works, right? You know, with Vioxx, for instance, a drug, I think it was for heart medication, right? Seemed to do all right in the clinical trials. And then when you released it wide, there were serious problems and people were dying. Right. And this is the one of the main problems with medicine writ large is that when we have small groups, especially when we're talking about mice or dogs, you know, that those are complicated, you're right, but they're also not humans with and also in a laboratory condition. So not even sure if you're studying the laboratory condition plus rapamycin, or if you're studying rapamycin, there's right. questions there yep. that it's hard to answer. And, you know, when I was talking about your friend, who I'm sorry that he died, you know, it is an N of one piece of data. And but his personal feelings on whether rapamycin hurt or not could just be confirmation bias
Absolutely.
of a career spent looking at that.
But let me give you another example, and you probably have heard of Alan Green. So Alan also died recently.
know
He
him.
was so he was an MD. He was probably the first MD to go public with the idea of using rapamycin off-label, and he prescribed rapamycin to, I don't know, more than 1,000 people off-label. He died recently. He actually started taking rapamycin because he was diagnosed with something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And there you can actually measure the progression of the disease using things like echocardiogram. And, he was able to see, at least this is the way he interpreted it, and he's an MD, that rapamycin actually delayed, if not reversed, aspects of his hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I don't disagree with what you said about needing many thousands of people to have a lot of confidence over the long term. Particularly, the drug could still work for the reason we think it works and have negative side effects that counteract the benefits. So to learn all of that before we make population recommendations, we need that data. But in Alan's case, the reversal of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy maps perfectly to what's been seen in multiple mouse models of dilated cardiomyopathy and hypertrophic cardiopathy, and in cats with rapamycin. So does it prove that it reverses that condition in humans? No, it doesn't prove it. Is it biologically plausible? Yeah, it's pretty plausible. And I do think it's reasonable to ask, why the hell haven't we had clinical trials for this? Like, we all know, NIH knows this data. Why haven't we had human clinical trials? And the answer is, this drug is off-label. There's no money to be made, right? So then the question becomes, and this is something I struggle with. So how do we move forward? We've got drugs that probably work. Nobody's going to pay to do the large clinical trials. How do we move forward to actually start to get reasonable data to get greater certainty? And so, I would love, believe me, Veronica Galvin and I wrote an article, I think 15 years ago now, talking about rapamycin clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. There is a ton of preclinical literature in every major animal model of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias that rapamycin either halts or even in some cases reverses progression of the disease. Why the hell hasn't that been done in humans? Because there's no money to be paid.
Because it's off-label. So, I mean, same thing with GLP-1.
So if I had a family member who had Alzheimer's disease, I would absolutely go to a doc and say, "Can you prescribe rapamycin?" Because I think it probably.
So once again, you're backing up 19th century medicine, where self-experimentation was the way that people proved things over and over again. Because the medical industry, I think, basically everyone in America right now agrees that our medical industry is hopelessly intertwined and corrupt and money driven, and we just want some evidence. We don't even need certainty. We just want evidence for things that are good, and especially, oh man, I can't believe I'm going to go here in this question, but I'm going to go here. When we talk about evidence things in the wellness space, right, where let's say I'm an expert on saunas and ice baths because I've written books on them, right? Which are, it's like there's a lot of stuff written about them, and it's like B plus evidence at best. Nothing gets into the A category on that stuff. But wouldn't it be cool if we had A plus evidence, and like no one's going to study this? And right now we are in a world where we are reassessing the way we think about medicine in America with RFK Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again movement, which actually, I am, just for the record, I think most of what they say is bananas. However, there are some critiques that they've made of the pharmaceutical industry, of the process of medicine, which actually land home. What do you think about these movements as they exist now? Do you have hopes or fears or dreams about what we're entering into?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's paying attention and rational has to have both hopes and fears, right? I mean, I think that these movements in general are reflecting what you described, which is the underlying angst that I think almost everybody shares, except for those who are getting insanely wealthy, by the current system as it exists today. I think the challenge is there are problems at so many different layers and levels that nobody really knows how to start to fix it. And so, one question would be, is it best to just tear the whole thing down and start over? I personally don't think so, but I think that's where some of this, movement comes from, is the system is so broken, just tear it all down. I think there are some things that can be done. I think we need to look at regulation. So the way FDA operates and the incentive structures there, I think we need, personally, again, I would look at, from the healthcare industry, the incentive structures that favor keeping people sick rather than keeping people healthy. I know we've already talked about this, but I think there are things that can be done there that probably both of us would align with. I would look at the way that research is funded in this country and the lack of accountability, both at the level of the funders and the scientists who are doing the research. I think there are specific steps that can be taken in each of those domains that could have a significant impact. I am both optimistic and a little nervous about what's coming, and I think we'll have to wait and see. And to the extent that my voice can add constructively to the discussion, I'm happy to have those conversations.
I mean, I think we feel the same ultimately there. All right, I want to go back to your reaction video that instigated this whole thing, and and for the record, I want to say that reaction videos, the genre, is very bad, and the reason why reaction videos tend to be bad is that you watch something for the first time and you want to react for the best emotional space on the camera, so you want to go in cold. Unfortunately, it's the same problem that everyone who's ever edited someone else's work will also realize, is that when you press stop, usually you're interpreting what the next sentence the person will say will be, and you critique them for not having said that sentence. You did this to me many times. I've also done this to other people in my reaction videos, and I sort of think that the genre should be erased from the internet because it just adds confusion to things. However, one thing that you said in your reaction videos, you asked me I was talking about the publication record of Andrew Huberman and saying that they have misused the scientific literature with using old boy connections to get things published that shouldn't have been. And I will play a clip right now of you talking. I've pointed out how this same old boy network has allowed scientists like Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia to use their positions to alter the scientific publication process.
So wait a minute, hold on. So, okay, Scott, why don't you show us the publication records of Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia, and we'll see how much they've actually dominated the literature.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Attia's an MD.
I don't even know if Peter's published in the scientific literature. So
yeah, he helps raise funds, I know, like Dog Aging Project or whatnot.
Yeah,
that's different.
Yeah. Come on, you can do better than that. So I don't think bashing the scientific process, sort of broadly speaking, based on a bitter scientist, is necessarily the best approach here, and making sort of broad, unjustified claims.
Okay.
You specifically asked me to show you the evidence, which I've actually done multiple videos on this topic, specifically around Andrew Huberman. I don't know about Attia's publication research. What I was talking about with Attia was that he was hired by Aura to get Aura used in scientific studies, which he was successful at. And with Huberman, what happened was he was on the editorial board of Cell Reports Medicine, which is a pretty well respected medical journal, ish. And he therefore had some ability to decide what gets put into the magazine. A paper came into him. I don't know how the paper was either solicited or directly submitted. I don't know, by Susanna Soberg, saying that ice bathing in the North Sea, rapidly increases brown adipose tissue or brown fat, which create huge metabolic improvements in someone's health. And we should all go do ice bathing. That article immediately landed on the cover, and the week after or so after it was on the cover of Cell Reports, he had her on his show, his Huberman Lab podcast, and from there she became one of the most famous ice bathers in the world and is now selling spa courses. She's no longer a scientist, and she's selling ice bathing as like a great plan. Now, I have nothing against ice bathing. I've written a book on it. But I will say that a study of 8 people swimming in Norway showing results that have never been reproduced is bad science. And what I'm arguing here is that people who now are public-facing individuals, public-facing scientists, and you are one, I guess, as well, but I don't know your record, so I'm not going to point at anything that you're doing here. But with Huberman, he gets a lot of clicks for showing extraordinary results. He sells ice baths, he sells these other things, and he has incentive to change what and to accept certain things as science, and he gets paid for it because of his relationships with these editorial boards. This, I feel like, is a new-ish problem for scientific journals. So I'm just responding to you here because you said I didn't do the evidence. I didn't have evidence for this, and now I've told you that this evidence exists.
Okay, I appreciate that. So first of all, it's not knowing all of the details, it's hard for me to comment specifically about this situation. I would agree with you that a study of 8 people, I don't know that I would call it bad science. It's typically not the level of science that you would expect to be in a high profile journal, of which this particular Cell journal is probably moderately high profile. So I would agree with that. It does not seem to rise to the standards you would typically expect. Having said that, and having published many, many papers and been in science for many, many years, crappy papers get published in high profile journals all the time. So I think the question is, did Huberman use his position inappropriately, unethically? I don't know the details. I do agree this has the appearance of a conflict of interest. And so, I think in general, it is smart of academic scientists to remove conflict of interest as much as possible. And most institutions require that. I do agree this sort of new era of influencer scientists creates new problems that the old system is not equipped to handle. But I also think it's useful for people to appreciate that there are all sorts of conflicts of interest built into the old system that, in my view, are probably even more pervasive and problematic than this particular situation. Scientists are rewarded all the time for leaving out data that doesn't fit their model. That's how you get high profile publications. Then you get the next grant. Then you get promoted. So yes, it is a problem when these conflicts of interest exist. And there are many other hidden conflicts of interest that are ingrained in the misaligned incentive structures in the system. So I'm not really, I guess that sounds like I'm trying to minimize this behavior, which I'm not. It's just that I see this as a larger reflection of a larger problem with the way that scientific journals operate and how they have such an oversized influence on the careers of the scientists, who gets access to federal funding, things like that. And so I think the whole system is problematic from that perspective.
And this is where, my background is as an anthropologist. I dropped out of my PhD, but it was cultural and medical anthropology was my specialty. And looking at science as a cultural system is very important, right? It's very important to understand that when we use the words science-based, or we start citing literature out there, we have this notion that something is objective, right? It has been published in a journal, therefore it is objective, and objective means not influenced by personal, subjective experiences, biases, etc.
And yet scientists are human beings. So,
Yeah. So how do we get and it goes to the heart of the very beginning of this entire discussion is how do we know what we know? How do we even approach scientific literacy? Let me phrase this as in a way that is useful for the audience. Is how do we know what science is when we hear it?
I don't have an answer to that question. I think there are a couple of ways that I think about the scientific literature. And then I'll try to answer your question of how do we know science when we hear it. When it comes to the scientific literature, the way I approach it is I want to see the same result replicated by at least 2, preferably more than that, independent labs. That's when I start to really feel like there's something real there. I think it's important, again, I alluded to this earlier, to recognize, though, that all of the things we believe to be true in science are probabilistic. Some of them are 99.9% sure. Some of them are 15% sure. But you have to, I think you're better off having that probabilistic mindset and recognizing there is very little that is established fact. It's just we're getting closer and closer to being confident that this is likely a reasonable representation of reality. So how do people know when something's science? Maybe it's easier to say, how do you know when it's probably not science? And I tend to say when people speak with 100% certainty, going back to what I just said about probabilities, it's probably not scientific, at least in the way they are communicating it. It may be that the underlying thing they are trying to communicate is likely to be true, and there is much science to back that. But generally, people who speak in 100% certainties are not scientific in their approach to data and evidence, in my experience. So that's one way that sets off alarm bells that make me question whether that person really understands what they're talking about. I think, it's not perfect. And certainly people use their credentials inappropriately all the time. But I think looking at whether people actually have done the homework and have some credentials in the space that they are claiming to be an expert about is useful. It doesn't prove that they're really telling you the truth, but it at least means they should know the difference between what's likely to be true and what's likely to be untrue. So people who actually have experience in the topic that they are communicating on, I think, are people I tend to trust more. And then, this seems pretty obvious to me, and yet I don't understand why more people don't adopt it. When somebody lies to you once, they're probably going to lie to you again. And I get that there are mistakes get made, that, we're all doing our best. Sometimes I say things that are not accurate, and it's accidental, and I try to correct the record. But there are also cases where it's very obvious that people have lied to you, and they're not even ashamed of it. To me, that's a real warning sign that is not somebody who takes a scientific approach to communications. And so I tend to stop listening immediately when people blatantly lie. And then the last approach I take is, and this is something where I think I'm somewhat uniquely positioned, when there are people who have expertise outside of aging or longevity or geroscience or whatever you want to call it. Maybe they're sleep experts, whatever. And they start talking about longevity and they get the facts wrong, then I tend to shut them out because it makes me think that if they're wrong about this, they're probably wrong about other areas that they're talking about that they don't have sufficient background knowledge. And it's an indication to me that they are lazy and unwilling to do their homework so they can get it right.
And thank you for saying all of those things, because we are completely in alignment here. As an investigative journalist, the two things that I focus on more than anything are history of lying. If I can document lies, it takes a lot of work to document a lie because, someone makes a statement, you have to pull evidence, you have to get all this information, and it is much easier to lie. So that if someone lies to you once and you can prove they lied, you probably never need to listen to them again because it's so much effort to debunk every single one. It's better to judge a person's character. Similarly related would, of course, be criminal records. Like if someone has a criminal record of fraud or something like that, this is the same thing where you can be like, well, maybe I'll trust a different scientist on this topic. The last thing which I think you didn't bring up, but I'd like to know your opinion on it: money. When somebody can make money making a claim, it's not immoral to make money. Sure. We have to make money. We are living in a capitalist system. This is not. We are not living in a system where you can be outside the monetary system. However, the amount of money that can come into you for making claims is directly proportional to your likelihood of telling the truth. And I guess I haven't formulated that perfectly. Because you can have a great idea that does work, that does make you a lot of money.
Right.
By and large, though, if the marketing is leading the way, or if you have a podcast and your podcast is about selling that one thing, I just took my first sponsor ever on this show, and when I did a read for it recently, I said, I'm pretty sure this company is not a scam. But it might be a scam, but it's a scam that I'm willing to take a risk on, which is not the strongest endorsement you've ever listened to, but it's the best I can do. And lastly, the other thing you said, which was so important, is the ability to issue corrections. There's a difference between a lie and a mistake, and I am willing to forgive mistakes, but I'm not willing to forgive lies. And the way you can tell is if somebody is actually putting out corrections to their records that are embarrassing, not the non-embarrassing ones, those don't matter, but the embarrassing ones, that is, because if no one is 100% right ever, so they need to be able to correct the record. We need to admit our mistakes. And we also need to, as listeners, not stigmatize people for making mistakes.
Right. I agree completely. And I do want to come back, though, to the money thing, because maybe there I don't agree completely with you. I totally get that perspective. This goes back to what I was talking about before with hidden conflicts of interest and misaligned incentive structures. I'm sure this is true in every industry. I know it best from academic science, because that's where I spent most of my career. But there are so many hidden incentives that are not directly connected to financial gain, meaning, scientists can have consulting agreements with companies or stock in companies they founded, things like that. That's pretty obvious. But the hidden incentives, I think, are more nefarious and in many ways are more likely to cause problems. And by problems here, we're talking about publication of misleading data, sometimes falsification of data, that contaminate the literature and take decades to clean up. And those are hidden in the sense that, this kind of bad behavior gets your papers published, like I said, in high profile journals. That leads to getting tenure. That leads to getting big grants. That leads to a higher salary, but it's 4 or 5 steps removed. So I suspect there are always those sorts of hidden conflicts of interest. And so it's not as much of a red flag for me if somebody is being transparent about their conflicts of interest and doing their best to put those out there publicly. I think you always need to recognize there could be a bias that influences the way they speak about these conflicts of interest or the companies involved. But I'm not as concerned about that as some of the other flags that we've talked about. Just because I know that there are all sorts of hidden things that you can't quantify or maybe aren't going to obviously be perceived as conflicts of interest that really are, and in my view, can in many cases more significantly alter behavior. And really that's what we're talking about. I think there is a small, and again, this is maybe I'm naive, I think there are a small number of people who have bad intentions. And then there are a larger number of people who have good intentions, but they get caught up in these misaligned incentives, these biases that they have that they don't recognize, and that causes them to do things that are counterproductive, sometimes falls over the line into bad behavior or illegal behavior. And so I think these hidden incentives sometimes cause that to happen.
As somebody who's been an investigative journalist for 25 years, I will tell you that almost all of the worst criminals I've ever interviewed, and I've interviewed a lot of really bad humans, they all have an explanation for why they're good people. Almost everyone has good intentions. Personally, I don't think intentions matter. I've stopped caring about someone's intentions because it is results are the thing that matters. So, for instance, I wrote a book on organ trafficking. I've met many organ traffickers who buy and sell human body parts, and they all tell me that they're saving lives. They never tell me that they're hurting the people that they're harvesting organs from. And same things with mafia dons. I've met mafia dons who have actually been involved in many targeted executions, and they say, well, it has to be this way because our legal system's broken. So they are looking at things from a different perspective, which is amoral, but it is moral from their perspective, which is why, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There's an old saying about this. Anyway, I appreciate this conversation. This was very interesting to me. I still think longevity medicine is not really medicine, but I do respect the way you think about these things. And it does seem like you are, you're trying to take the evidence as it comes. And I think that cautionary approach is essential in what we're doing. And I think we're all going to muddle through this, and we'll see how this all shakes out in 5 or 10 years. In fact, I think 2 years ago, you said that in 10 years, we are going to, let me pull up this quote. You said that in 10 years, we are going to have advances that will let most people make it to 100, 110, or 120. We have 8 years left. What are those advances?
Well, first of all, I'd like to know the source of that quote, because I usually couch that in we may have, this may happen. I very rarely, if ever, go to certainties like that. So I doubt I said those words explicitly. I think it's not unreasonable to think that the sort of current generation of interventions and the things that we will discover in the next 10 years could give most people the opportunity to make it past 100 in good health, maybe to 110, maybe 120. I don't see anything right now that convinces me that we have figured out how to do better than that. But if we accept that I said there is a likelihood or a high likelihood of this happening, then I would suggest that even right now, given what we know, we probably can get most people close to 95 to 100 years with optimal lifestyle modification. I think that's, again, I can't prove it, so don't ask me to. But I think that's probably the case, right? Certainly, I think we can get most people 15 years of health span. So what advances could move us beyond that? Again, this is total speculation. I don't know whether rapamycin will have similar effects in people as it does in mice. If it does, we're done. We're there. 25% increase in average lifespan. Given that there are probably 10 to 12 other interventions out there that are maybe not as well established in the preclinical literature as rapamycin, but that are potentially comparable in effect size, I think we've got several shots on goal for identifying interventions that slow biological aging, increase human lifespan, potentially by a couple of decades. Will we know that in 8 to 10 years? Probably not. This gets back to the incentive structures, the clinical trials. How do you test these things? How does FDA regulate them? I think we will know in dogs whether or not rapamycin or other interventions that are currently being tested can increase lifespan by 10%, 20%, 30% in companion dogs in that time frame. I suspect we will have the first FDA-approved longevity drug in companion animals in the next 5 years, maybe within the next couple of years. It will be conditional approval. We could come back on and talk about the conditional approval process at FDA if you want to, but I think that will happen. So progress is being made. Whether or not we're going to know these things work to slow aging in humans in a 5-year time frame, I don't know. It's possible. I think it depends on how things evolve. Like a lot of people, I tend to be over optimistic sometimes and less optimistic other times. Right now, I'm sort of pessimistic at the pace of advance in the field. And that's, again, a whole nother topic that I have talked about. So I don't know if it's going to happen quickly, but I do think it's going to happen. And I see nothing from the biological side that says this is likely to be all that difficult, much more difficult in humans, given the apparent conservation of the biology of aging. I think the cultural the structural things that make it more difficult to prove these things work in humans will make it take longer.
Okay, so you are 40.
No, I'm 50. I'm almost 54.
Okay, so you're 54 right now. What I suggest is let's have a follow-up conversation in 50 years.
You got it.
And we will see how we're doing. and if we have that conversation, we can have it one before then too. But if we have that conversation, we both win.
There you go. That sounds good to me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Matt Kaeberlein, I've already mentioned his YouTube channel earlier. And if you want to just watch him just rip into me for like an hour and 10 minutes about how I'm a shady journalist, go check out his video. It's linked down.
Hey, hold on. I apologize if that's the way it came off. That was absolutely not my intention with that React video. My intention really was to make the point that I don't think the entire field should be blasted for the bad actions of one or a couple of people. Only one of whom I would argue is actually even in the field.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. From PokeyBear LLC in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Talks to Matt Kaeberlein. Investigates.